traumatized by the blitzkrieg of the second Trump administration. 3 weeks after the start of this administration, thousands of migrants have been arrested. Many are now being sent to the Guantanamo prison. There are also plans to send many to a large prison complex in El Salvador. The January 6, 2021 coup promoters and insurrectionists, including heads of fascist paramilitary organizations such as Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, have been pardoned by Trump. Thousands of federal employees are being fired. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have been banned. The education department is being shut down. The federal budget has been frozen. The USAID has been shut down, ending vital food and health programs for millions in the global South. The federal budget and the federal treasury's payment system have been put in the hands of the world's richest man, Elon Musk, a man who is an openly Nazi sympathizer, gives the Hitler salute, and calls on Germans to get over their guilt over the Holocaust. Trump is openly advocating imperialist expansionist campaigns and plans to take over the Panama Canal, Greenland, and now Gaza, or Gaza as it's pronounced in Arabic, where he wants to push over 2 million Palestinians out of their homeland. His administration has also launched economic warfare against friendly nations such as Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Those of us who live in Los Angeles have been traumatized by the latest fires, which are directly related to climate change caused by the use of fossil fuels. Yet the Trump administration plans to drill even more fossil fuels, has threatened to withhold FEMA aid, and is pushing the state of California to rebuild homes in fire-prone areas and slash all safety and environmental regulations. In the midst of this blitzkrieg, the Democratic Party leadership have mostly bowed to the Trump administration and have not offered any real opposition or perspectives to help the 75 million people who voted for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in the 2024 presidential election. There have been some local protests against the mass arrests and deportations of migrants, and Musk's shutting down of USAID and his takeover of the federal budget and the treasury. But the reality of 77 million Americans voting for Trump and the fear of being attacked by government-backed vigilantes and the forces of this new administration have prevented large protests. In previous presentations, I have cited the work of leading historians of fascism, such as Robert Paxton and Jason Stanley, to argue that what we face in the US today is fascism and not simply authoritarianism. It is retrogression bubbling from below and not simply force from above. Fascism, as discussed by Robert Paxton, is defined by 3 key elements. 1, the mass rejection of reason and critical thinking. 2, the mass embrace of social Darwinism or the ideology of survival of the fittest. 3, complicity on the part of leaders and elites who are not fascists, but bow to fascism and facilitate its rule. Faced with this ominous reality, we need to be firmly rooted in a conceptual framework or philosophical perspective that represents the absolute opposite of fascism. That is why in this training course, we're beginning with the philosophical principles of humanism. It is on the basis of these philosophical principles that we will analyze the burning issues of the day, expose the disinformation and the brutalities, and delve into the roots of problems to try to offer comprehensive solutions and alternatives. Humanism is a broad philosophical tradition and has many variations within it. The humanist philosophical perspective that I will offer in this class series is based on my study of Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Karl Marx, Erich Fromm, Raya Dunayevskaya, Frantz Fanon, and Audre Lorde. It represents the idea that humans can come together around universal principles and shared meaning, develop their potential for reasoning to solve problems, and move forward collectively and cooperatively to transform society. Some of the humanist thinkers I mentioned fall into the category of liberalism, and others are revolutionaries who believe that the realization of humanism goes hand in hand with the abolition of the capitalist mode of production and the abolition of racism and sexism. All of these thinkers, however, stand in contrast to the anti-humanism of thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, who reject reason and universality and view life as an eternal struggle for power and domination. For today's class, we will discuss three key works from the humanist tradition: the German idealist philosopher Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysical Morals, which was published in 1785, Karl Marx's essay on alienated labor, written in 1844 and published nearly a century later in 1932, and US Black feminist Audre Lorde's essay, The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House, originally published in 1979. In class 2, we will discuss the main underlying causes of the global rise of authoritarianism and fascism in the 21st century, causes such as the concentration and centralization of capital in fewer hands, multipolar imperialism, misogyny, and the high-tech assault on the mind. For that class, you have the link to the slides in the syllabus. And we will also have study questions. Class 3 will be about how to become critical humanist thinkers, writers, activists. We will discuss Marianne Wolf's concept of deep reading, and we'll then have 2 in-class assignments on 2 of the burning issues of the day: the Los Angeles fires and the ongoing assault, deportation, and incarceration of migrants and immigrants. Class 4 will be about opposing warmongering and practicing international solidarity. You will be asked to watch a film on feminist solidarity with Ukraine prior to the class. Then we will discuss the various specific proposals for solidarity with Ukraine and struggles in other parts of the world, from the Middle East and Africa to Latin America and China. Now, back to today's class on what is humanism. I would like to start by giving a short synopsis of each of the readings. Would you please go to the next slide, JJ? JJ, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So I would like to start by giving a short synopsis of each of the readings and explain how each can help us combat fascism. Then we will take an hour to discuss the readings and to hear from class participants. So slide 3, please, the next slide. And the next one. Thank you. So Kant's groundwork for the metaphysical morals. This is one of the key works in the history of moral philosophy. It was written a few years before the French Revolution and was part of a multi-volume project by Kant. In this work, Kant articulates the idea of a categorical, meaning absolute imperative, that human beings must abide by. His categorical imperative is similar to what we know as the golden rule, or the idea that you must treat others the way that you would like to be treated. However, it is much more profound than the golden rule, because the key point for Kant is the following, and this is a direct quote from him: treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of anyone else, always as an end and never merely as a means. In other words, treat neither yourself nor another person as a mere means to an end, but as an end in itself. A lot has been written about the contradictions between Kant's exalted philosophical views on human worth and some of his earlier statements, which are racist and defend colonialism. Most Kant scholars, most Kant scholars, however, argue that in his later life, Kant changed his mind on those questions. They also argue that his concept of the absolute worth of humanity should not be thrown out because of Kant's own personal limitations. So for the purpose of this course, I would say that we can learn a great deal from his categorical imperative for practicing humanism today, for the following reasons. One, it is not only about how you treat others, but also how you should not abuse yourself. Secondly, Kant argues that society has a responsibility for creating the conditions for flourishing and what he calls greater perfection of humans, and that each human being should actively and positively contribute to the happiness of others. So that's a little bit on Kant. Now, next slide, please. And the next slide. Thank you. Marx's essay on alienated labor. So we go forward 60 years and see how Karl Marx approaches the question of humanism in 1844 in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, which became the foundation for the rest of his work. This is being written at the time of the beginning of the time of the Industrial Revolution, at the time when he's active in Paris, and is also involved with the struggles in England, which is really the heart of industrial capitalism in Europe. And so all of these factors influence his thinking. In his essay, Alienated Labor, Marx was arguing that under capitalism, the laborer and nature become a mere means for the expansion of monetary value. So you can see the Kantian influence already, that he's also thinking in terms of mere means versus ends in themselves. But so he sees that under capitalism, the laborer and nature become a mere means for the expansion of monetary value. He was questioning classical political economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo and others for starting with private property and not with labor. He was challenging them for concealing the alienation in the nature of labor under capitalism. And he instead argued that we need to begin by questioning alienated labor. And he went on to define 4 characteristics of alienated labor. And it's the following. The worker is alienated from the product of their labor, which appears as something external, autonomous, and opposed to them, which dominates them. The worker is alienated from the process of labor, which does not freely develop their mental and physical capacities, and instead physically exhausts and mentally debases them. Third, the worker is alienated from what he calls their species character, by which Marx meant their ability for free and conscious self-directed activity. And fourth, as a result of all the above, the worker is alienated from other human beings. Marx then concluded that every form of servitude and domination, including gender-based violence, is a consequence or a modification of the relation of worker, regardless of gender, to production. That alienation in labor keeps reproducing itself in various forms of domination in human relations and society as a whole. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back, please. I'm sorry. Go back to, yes, Marxist concept. So from his standpoint, are you sure? Oh, no, absolutely. I thought there would be one more. Yes, this. Okay. From his standpoint, a thoroughgoing humanism or naturalism, which he called his philosophy, could only be achieved when the labor process was no longer alienating. Overcoming alienated labor was the necessary but not sufficient step. Non-alienated labor to him meant that people could engage in free and conscious collective and individual activity and develop their mental and physical abilities in the process. Humanism also required the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. Again, this private ownership of means of production, not private ownership, not the abolition of private ownership of your personal belongings. So he was talking, when he talks about private property, he's talking about private property of the means of production. So humanism required, or the realization of humanism required the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production and genuine control by producers over the process of production, especially the time needed for production. And I discuss this concept of time in more detail in my book on socialist feminism, in the chapter on alternatives to capitalism. This revolutionary transformation, from his vantage point, could only be realized in an international setting. And I mean, clearly, if we look at what happened in communist countries, the USSR, China, and their satellite countries, it was far from anything like this. It was, so state capitalist totalitarianism. So now that we've had a bit of Marx and a bit of Kant, let's go to Audre Lorde. Next slide, please. Next. So Audre Lorde's "The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House." This essay by Audre Lorde was originally written for a panel on the personal and the political at a conference on the 30th anniversary of the publication of Simone de Beauvoir's feminist classic, The Second Sex. Lorde, as a Black feminist lesbian activist, a librarian, a professor of literature, writer, and poet, believed that humanity could only move forward when people came together around universal concepts of emancipation. At the same time, she emphasized that we cannot come together and develop a vision of human liberation if we ignore race, class, gender, and age discrimination and oppression that people experience based on those differences. What is very special about her humanist vision is that she thought difference, and this is her statement, difference must be not merely tolerated, but delved into in order to create a more enriched and comprehensive vision of emancipation. Differences should not be ignored, but acknowledged, discussed, and become the basis for deeper ideas and actions to overcome oppression. This view is very different from the post-structuralist view of difference that became established from the early 1980s on within the academic world. It is not about difference as an end in itself and a continuous struggle for power and domination. Rather, it's about what Lorde called the dialogue of non-dominant differences to promote human solidarity, to arrive at new ideas, new conclusions, and true visions of the future and ways of bringing that future into being. So in her essay, this essay we did not read for today, but I recommend it. In an essay called Scratching the Surface, Some Notes on Barriers to Women and Loving, she wrote about how critically important it is for humans to confront racism, sexism, heterosexism, and homophobia. She saw these forms of discrimination as forms of blindness. That's her term, forms of blindness, all with the same root. And the root was an inability to recognize the notion of difference as a dynamic human force, one which is enriching rather than threatening to the defined self when there are shared goals. In that same essay, Lorde also challenged the distorted view of relationships that leads from disagreement to destruction. She called this distorted view a jugular vein psychology based on the fallacy that your assertion or affirmation of self is an attack upon myself, or that my defining myself will somehow prevent or retard your self-definition. Instead, she envisioned moving together as self-defined persons toward a common goal. So that's a bit about Lorde. Next slide, please. And the next one. Can you go? Okay, thank you so much. So in conclusion, 3 concepts for humanist opposition. Now that we've had a synopsis of the 3 pieces by Kant, Marx, and Lorde, I would like to sum up why these humanist works are needed today to help us fight fascism. What Kant called the categorical imperative, or the idea of not treating another human being as a mere means, but as an end in itself, is a profound challenge to dehumanization, which has become entrenched in the minds of millions of people in this country. It is a challenge to the criminalization of vulnerable populations and the us versus them mentality, which is being used to promote mass incarceration and enslavement. Just as relevant for today is Marx's argument about the connections between the capitalist mode of production and alienation. Marx's discussion of the 4 types of alienation can help us address, or the 4 characteristics of alienation, can help us address the problems of alienation within US society and understand why so many people are voting against their own interests. This is not an economic reductionist argument, which only focuses on wages and the price of food and housing, as important as those factors are. Marx's analysis helps us recognize that alienation has deep objective and material roots in the capitalist mode of labor itself, regardless of how well paid or underpaid workers are, and how low or high prices are. So long as this mode of labor is dominant, the alienation will not be overcome. At the same time, Marx's work offers a vision of a new humanist alternative that goes far beyond Kantian humanism and involves treating neither humanity nor nature as mere means. Audre Lorde's emphasis on the need to address differences, especially race, class, gender, and age discrimination, is a profound challenge to the current fascist assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lorde's essay is not simply advocating DEI, equal opportunity, and a fair share. Lorde shows that without the recognition of differences and correcting the wrongs of generations of race, gender, and class discrimination, humanity will not be able to move forward and flourish. It will instead stagnate and retrogress into barbarism. Differences expressed by human beings from the standpoint of equality, not domination, are necessary for human development and the further expansion of a vision of the future. These three key concepts that I just explained, I would argue, are essential for an opposition movement against fascism. They're essential because they can help us confront fascism at its heart. That is the us versus them mentality of dehumanization, fascism's use of alienation to destroy critical thinking, its embrace of the logic of naked capitalism, and its reduction of differences to revenge-taking and destruction. This is the end of my presentation. So now I would like to take the time to hear from you about your questions and comments. I have 3 general questions available on the next slide. JJ, would you please go to the next slide? One more. Thank you. So these are 3 questions.